All right, welcome to the Nietzsche Dialogues. I'm here with doctoral student Thomas Winn, who's an expert in Nietzsche, among other topics related to postmodernism, related to the work of Heidegger, the work of Gianni, Vattimo, as well as Slavoj, Žižek. And in this discussion, we are going to dive into the topic of nihilism. The topic of nihilism is, of course, famously associated with Friedrich Nietzsche. Many philosophers interpret Nietzsche to open up new dimensions of nihilism in the modern world. I think perhaps most famously, we can see that this is connected to the idea of the death of God. We can see this is connected to the idea that there are no eternal values. There are no eternal meanings or one transcendental meaning, which unifies the entire human species for all time. And Nietzsche kind of consequently opens up this void, opens up this nothingness, which continues, which I think is often interpreted as haunting the 20th century, and which we can interpret as continuing to haunt 21st century civilization. So I'm really excited for this topic of overcoming nihilism, because actually in my reading of Nietzsche, there's a deep and profound life affirmation that can be found in Nietzsche, which, yes, involves, I think, confronting a lot more negativity, a lot more emotional turmoil than most people perhaps would be comfortable with, or most people would anticipate in the becoming of their life. But nevertheless, I think Nietzsche does point a way that ultimately, I think, does have something to do with overcoming nihilism. So first, welcome to the channel, Thomas, and super excited for this conversation. Why don't you introduce yourself, a little bit of your background, so people know who you are, where you're coming from, and maybe connect it a little bit to this topic of overcoming nihilism.
No, perfect. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I think it's nice because we've had two conversations offline, well, not offline, but off recording, and it's been moments in which I've seen that actually on this online space you can talk about these themes, such as the series you did on the philosophy of lack, which overlaps directly with the question of nothingness, of transience, of the lack of meaning, like you said, the death of God. So no, it's a pleasure to be here. Like, I'm pleased, and hopefully we can make this as clear as possible. I think I have some people watching who are interested to see if I can talk about nihilism in a way which is open, conversational, because of course, like we said a moment ago, we're talking about the problem of nothingness, of transience, of becoming, these themes which in our daily life seem to be quite void, literally void. But like in our common sense relationship to the world, we're still affected by our culture, our Western metaphysical culture, to use Heidegger's favorite phrase, in diagnosing our condition. So basically,
So how did you come to this? How did you come to this?
Okay, we can get a little bit on the personal side, because I enjoyed, like I said, is it Layman Pascal's Nietzsche? And what I watched that talk, it was a very, you can say, subjective, personal mediation with Nietzsche's thinking. For me personally as well, when I was 19, I entered Christianity. I know you had another talk on Christianity. I think it was the one before. I went through Christianity. I would still say in some sense, and I can't attribute value to this, I am a Christian. But I see the problem of calling myself a Christian because I'm evaluating who I am, what I am, according to an idea, a notion. But in passing through Christianity, I realized that there was a problem in my ability to talk about what I was calling God, what I was calling this event of nothingness, spirit, which radically entered my life when I was around 19 years old. And I passed through the church and I saw contradiction after contradiction, value after value, morality after morality. And for me, the biggest teaching of Christianity at that point in my life was about the absolute lack of value because of the teaching of Christ. And I found through leaving the church, through reading, there's a particular philosopher who's not well known in academia called Alan Watts. I think he's well known on the online web. talking about things like beyond theology, or talking about things like the wisdom of insecurity, where within the place of insecurity we find the event of what you can call God, what you can call Christ, what you can call the Tao, following Taoist teachings. So that it was at that point where I picked up Nietzsche. I think it was quite spontaneous. That was my first introduction to Western philosophy, was Nietzsche. But I think the good thing is with Nietzsche, what he's diagnosing in his criticism of Western metaphysics, and again, using a Heideggerian phrase there, is a type of a characteristic of our thinking, which is a very Greek Christian idea of how we know something. Nietzsche's polemic against Christianity, against morality, against the dogmatic thinking in Western philosophy is a critique of a type of thinking. And here I'm going to try and again. By the way, like I said before, if I slip into this Heideggerian mode, and I'll try and explain what that means, that there's a reason why, because this critique is based upon this idea, and I'll try and make this as clear as possible. That we think we know something as soon as we can determine what that thing is, as soon as we can evaluate properties, as soon as we can place that thing that we're talking about, whether it's a person, a dog, an idea, the meaning of life, as soon as we place that into a system of meaning, a unified, sensible structure, we know what that is, and we can place this. And this is the task of metaphysics as we've understood it, is to know being, to know our relationship in existence. And I think that's our common sense approach. Like if you think about on a daily level how we relate to things, as soon as I meet you and say, oh, hi, what's your name? My name is Cadell. In a way, I think I know who you are. And we function in this way where we signify the signified, and we structure it, we unify it, and we go on from there. We attribute meaning, we attribute value. Now I'll try and go back to Nietzsche and my personal experience. Nietzsche was my introduction to what I see as a thread through Western philosophy. I would say a post-Kantian, Immanuel Kant philosophy, which introduces the problem of time. You can say space and time. Time as transience, time as finitude, time as becoming, meaning that when I say something about somebody, there's a kind of unconscious, subconscious, whatever you want to call it, awareness that the thing I'm talking about is subjectively mediated, meaning I come from my place in my culture with a particular language in a particular epoch. And I also come from my subjective position where I've acquired symbolic meaning, symbolic value through my experience. So there's this awareness, and I think this was really important in my Christianity, to see how am I thinking God? How am I thinking myself in relationship to the world? And for a short while, it was very unified. It was very theological. It was very structured. But quickly I saw the inability to value that. And at the time, and even now, I would call it because of the fact that, in fact, with nothingness, with this, and maybe I'm going a bit off tangent in how I'm describing this, but with nothingness, this is the place of what you can call spirit, what Slavoj Žižek calls the spirit of the community, this empty space where things happen. And so my philosophical reading since then, which has encountered Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and like you said, the two contemporary philosophers who I'd like to try and talk about today in relationship to Nietzsche's own overcoming of nihilism, Gianni, Vattimo, and Slavoj Žižek, because I think each thinker in their own way, especially today, contributes towards an understanding, and this is really central, of how it is that today within nihilism, within this problem of nothingness, which is, like you said, haunting us, in the sense of when I say something, I'm aware of this subjectivity. When I say something, I'm aware that what I'm talking about is subject to time. Things pass, people pass on. The question is basically how today, in what's called the postmodern situation, how can we think absolutely? And of course, this is the biggest challenge for Alain Badiou. This is the central question of philosophy. Is there anything with a universal value? And if so, how is this possible? I think today we have to re-encounter through people like Nietzsche, this question of how, within what seems to be the lack of meaning, is there any way we can encounter absoluteness. And so basically, sorry, my personal experience has been kind of centered on that question, coming through Christianity, but also placing that into important themes like event. How does an event relate to knowing? Is there such a thing as like the event of being, as Heidegger would say, which my knowing can't know, but that I can experience? And that has made more sense to me, like when you watch something like a sunset from a nice small village and you feel this peace and you say, wow, this is really meaningful without me having to know what this is. I think those experiences have kind of overridden my Western idea of I should know what this is. I should determine what this is, and yes, and now I'm in academia. Now I'm doing a PhD, focusing on Gianni, Vattimo, and Slavoj Žižek on the concept of releasement, Gelassenheit in German. Yeah, all good stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, there's a lot to connect there.
Maybe
I guess,
too much.
Yeah. Well, let's start with. I remember, as I've often sort of mentioned, I think in this little Nietzsche dialogue series, that I was strongly influenced by the New Atheists when I was becoming an academic. And I remember someone who was loosely connected or adjacent to the New Atheist community, a physicist by the name of Lawrence Krauss, someone who was a physicist who's strongly against philosophy as such. And I remember in one of his discussions on cosmology, he joked that philosophers were experts on nothing. And he was saying this.
That's a compliment, I think.
Right. Well, he was saying it this is what I'm trying to get to. He was saying it in a derogatory way. Philosophers are experts on nothing, whereas I'm an expert on the technical understandings of quantum mechanics and stuff like that. But you are literally a doctoral student in philosophy who is in some sense focused on the question of nothing. And you say you're focusing on this.
It's kind of useless, yeah.
Right. That it's useless.
For me, that's become a compliment, by the way.
Right. Yeah. This philosophers are experts on nothing. So, if you take the example you sort of ended off with, where in your personal experience you've gone from this Western metaphysical point of view, that you have to know something in terms of its idea or something like that, as opposed to just sort of being with the experience in a more a not knowing stance. How do you connect that with perhaps the concept of releasement or Gelassenheit and the contemporary philosophical field of figures like Vattimo and Žižek?
Yeah, you've worded that very well. Nice question. I don't know. I think it reminds me of the two conversations we've had before. I think this is a theme that came up. I think the problem of our society, and even if I'd like to mention him because he was really a big influence, this Alan Watts in this book, The Wisdom of Insecurity in the Age of Anxiety, it themes itself around this differentiation between the idea of something and the thing itself. And when you say thing itself, it's not always meaning like the essence of something that we can know. It means like the phenomena. So that in philosophy, there's phenomenology, which is a philosophy which tries to deal with this awareness of, when I think about something, I am the thinker of that thing. So maybe I can have an experience phenomenologically, of the thing, through perception, through intuition, through a different mode of knowing, a different quality of knowing. And I think this did interest me more. However, with what I would say over the last 5 years, there's been an interest in postmodern philosophy with Žižek. Actually, I can introduce Žižek here primarily as well, because I think in reading him, it introduced the problem of the fact that in all instances of any experience, I'm the thinker who thinks. So when I think about something, there's no escaping that thinking, but perhaps there is a different quality of thinking which can take place. So instead of me just saying, okay, I'm going to release my thinking away from abstractions and encounter the real thing in itself, which would be a form of letting go, which is tied to, you could say maybe like Zen Buddhism, with this focus on desire and like the minimization of desire in place of the thing itself, i.e. experience. I had a nice conversation last week with a girl who's reading Taoism and Nietzsche. It was very interesting. And she said Taoism is nothing to do with desire, it's to do with your relationship to the Tao, to life, to the ongoingness, the flux of becoming, where it's not about restricting yourself or letting go of thinking to acquire a true sense of what is. It's about being aware that your experience of that thing is always subjectively mediated, but that's the place of creativity and play and interpretation, which again is a very Nietzschean theme, to say that in my own relationship to this thing, I am thinking it, but that's also the beauty of the thing. And I think you can relate this to the question of God. Like, God is not an object which is out there. It's the very ability or possibility of me to be able to think of that empty space itself. So I think a lot of contemporary philosophy, postmodern philosophy, some postmodern philosophy, attempts, like I would say Slavoj Žižek, although he would not call himself a postmodern thinker, and I would say there is a difference, attempts to thinking in this, to go back to what we said, this failure of thinking to truly equate the idea to the thing. So one of my favorite books from Slavoj Žižek is called Disparities, and it's literally a working through of this problem of the I that thinks and the thing which is to be thought about. Me here thinking and the bottle of water on my table. How do we have a true relationship to that thing? Is it through my thinking? Or is it through an awareness that there is no difference between my thinking and the thing, which is very Hegelian, you know? Like the other is kind of produced in my thinking, the very distinction between me that thinks and the thing thought about. And I think this is absolute idealism for Hegel. And I think a lot of my personal experiences in life, I would tend to more towards that perspective, where it's not a case of either like thinking in abstract terms, what Žižek would call gray notional terms, where the life world is dried up into this gray abstract philosophical world. There's a moment in knowing where we become aware of the fact that even what I called the world was always notional. And that's the moment of a releasement, because I don't even make a distinction between the subject which thinks and the thing thought about. And I know that sounds quite complicated, and maybe we could bring that back to Nietzsche, but that's a real, I think, more nuanced perspective towards this relationship between the thinker who thinks and the thing thought about. Me as a subjective human being thinking about God, and the God that apparently is out there, and me realizing that there is no distinction because that distinction was already thought by me in the first place. So I think a lot of contemporary philosophy, good postmodern philosophy, is returning to that sense of being aware that even the foundational aspects of our thinking were themselves produced by our own subjective thinking, to the point where we encounter a non-dichotomous thinking. Hegel talks about this actually.
Yeah,
And
it sounds like a return to Hegel in some sense. So in this distinction between the idea versus the thing in itself, it seems to me like we can apply the logic of the negation here. So for example, if we have the situation of what Heidegger is calling Western metaphysics being focused on this idea as opposed to the thing in itself, and then we have this sort of Zen-like releasement into the things in themselves as against our thinking, as I've experienced, for example, I've experienced both of these sides of the coin. So, for example, I've had experiences with traditional Christians who have this idea of an external God that exists independent of me, who is basically an idea that even if I can't sense or experience God, I have to have some faith in its existence, for example.
Yeah.
Versus I've been to a Buddhist temple, for example, where I remember this going into the bathroom and above the urinals, they had a sign that said ideas are just in your head, sort of trying to get rid of any of your connection to ideas. sort of to a releasement to the things, and that was sort of emphasized throughout the entire Buddhist retreat as a kind of releasement to sense perception, a releasement to sort of a
To where you are.
unfiltered, to an unfiltered experience or mediation of reality. And then you have this is what I would say is like the negation of the negation, is because you have the negation of the idea in the Zen Buddhist tradition, but then you have the negation of the negation, which is that the subject is itself always involved in the creation of the object, and you can't really escape this relation. So, but for me, what that brings up is kind of the idea of potentially the rebirth of God in some sense, or the potential rebirth of God. So we have Nietzsche on the one hand saying the Christian metaphysics is really disconnected from the thing in itself in terms of the life flux and the will to power and so forth. But then you have the question of the recreation of the world in some sense. Like, for example, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, towards the end of the book, he talks about, and throughout the book is kind of a theme, he talks about the future rulers of the earth and the future 1,000-year empire that his children will produce and stuff like that. And presumably there will be some sort of metaphysics here involved potentially. So how do you in your work deal with this weird negation of negation, if you're okay with that term?
Yeah, I really enjoy this term, thanks to Žižek and understanding what it means, because it took a while to understand what the negation of the negation means. And Žižek connects it to something else called self-relating negativity, which in my research, because Žižek's maybe like the third out of 4 parts, and it's a big chunk of my work, is focused on the negation of the negation and self-reflective negativity. And I'd like to just touch on self-reflective negativity and try and open what that means, because I think it connects to Nietzsche's eternal reoccurrence of the same. And I think this might connect it quite well to what you've just said as well. So like my understanding of self-relating negativity is the idea that when I understand who I am, I'm understanding who I am through the idea, through the concept, through my notion of my own subjectivity. So if I ask myself the question, who am I? And I have an idea of who I am, the negation of the negation is to realize that that's my own idea. And that idea becomes weakened or, malleable. It becomes, I see it as like a relative perspective. But what happens is I fall upon something, and I fall upon what Hegel calls self-consciousness, because I realize that I'm not that idea. But there I've discovered the very place from which I thought that idea. This is really connected to Heidegger's reading of Descartes, if anyone's interested. That when I go down to the base root, the only thing I encounter is the ongoingness of my thinking, which is why for Descartes, the cogito is the high certainty of thinking, because you catch yourself thinking. You catch yourself in a type of self-consciousness. So self-relating negativity is to say, even myself, which is the foundation of thinking, in modern philosophy, which it is, it's the high certainty, even that idea of myself is to be negated, to be thrown away in a way. I don't like to use that term, but it's just a nicer way to understand it, because I see how that idea of myself is, use the word, produced, posited. But for Hegel, that's the moment when I catch the production. So he uses the word form. I realize that the form of myself, the idea of myself as a form, is being formed by me. And so I catch the event of the forming. And that's the highest certainty. It's not the idea of myself, it's the event of that unfolding. The transformation is a nice way to understand that. I think that with Nietzsche's polemic against Christianity, the idea of another God is in a way a type of negation and a type of self-relating negativity. If we read his will to power alongside what he understands as the eternal reoccurrence of the same. And I've really picked this up from Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche, and I would say it's come through my own reading of Nietzsche over these 8-9 years, of how Nietzsche's the word polemic, meaning like to go against. His whole project of destructuring or annihilating the structures that we've held in our thinking is really radical, because it doesn't, in a way, what it does is it's not just, so if we can talk about the, I'm sure you've talked about it in your lecture courses that you've given so far on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the devaluation of the highest values is this idea that all of these values that we have attributed to existence, to meaning, or to an existence beyond existence, the way we've unified our structures of understanding, the way we make sense out of everything, the devaluation of these values is because Nietzsche sees that these values are empty, literally nihil, literally without value. And what this does, and I think this is what is radical about Nietzsche, he also devalues the very place from which we needed values that were higher than our existence, that place meaning in another world, a future existence beyond this life, to the degree that actually you can read in Nietzsche how, especially in his later work, when he turns to the interest in interpretation. So the question is put forward, I think he writes this in Ecce Homo at the end, where he talks about what is the status of knowing for the Übermensch, for the overman. The status of knowing is illusion, par illusion. It's literally everything that we produce, every idea we have, even about life and death, existence, even about God, is always illusionary, always, in every instance. So there's an aphorism that Gianni Vattimo, the other postmodern, for, I don't like to use the term for Žižek, but Vattimo self-declares himself as a postmodern thinker. Vattimo's central philosophy orientates itself around Nietzsche's maxim, aphorism, that there are no facts, only interpretations, but even this is an interpretation. And you can see the negation of the negation at work there. You say everything is illusionary, even me saying this, and what that does, it takes away this desire that we have to say, okay, well, if everything is illusionary, what about truth? What about life? You know, so if he's affirming life, how can he affirm life if even life is illusionary? Because I think what he does, his negativity, places him in a position where every instance of our idea towards something is defolded, it falls up back upon itself, because we see that it's just a part of becoming. Like even my idea of what life is subject to time, which means transience, or the coming to be and the passing on. Even my idea about life, even my idea about Zarathustra, whose teaching is the eternal recurrence, and the Übermensch, or the overman, it's always subject to time. I think that Nietzsche, and this is thanks to Vattimo, he's postmodernized Nietzsche in this way, and many people would disagree. Heidegger would disagree. Heidegger would say that Nietzsche is the completion of metaphysics. He actually completes it. He actually brings metaphysics to its final peak, the top of the mountain, where he's up on the mountain breathing in this cold air, because he's brought metaphysics to its final point, which is the becoming of becoming. But the way Vattimo reads this, it means that there's a negation of negation at play, meaning when I go to affirm life, what I'm affirming is my very place in that moment in which I experience as an event becoming. And that's why he talks about this is the most abysmal thought. Even in the earlier part of Zarathustra, he speaks about this is the horror of the eternal reoccurrence at first. Because if you say that everything is subject to becoming, even our notion of becoming itself, you're constantly falling upon the place where you are, which is radical. And maybe I think this kind of connects to Žižek, where he talks about the gap. Maybe you've covered that in your Less Than Nothing series. He talks about the gap, because you're constantly falling upon your place within becoming. So even the distinction between life and non-life, time and not non-time, they fall apart in the event. And again, by the way, some people who know Heidegger would say, Thomas, you're just following Heidegger, talking about the event, talking about what now is being, you know. But I would say that's the most powerful understanding of how far Nietzsche goes, and it's through Heidegger actually. And people think that Heidegger doesn't go far enough, but I would say in his reading of Nietzsche, he brings us to where we are. So when Nietzsche talks about the now with a capital N, it's because of that event of the now, not just the notion, you know.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit more about, in the context of overcoming nihilism, I think it would be interesting to talk about what Nietzsche is basically saying here is the most abysmal thought or the most nihilistic thought. And here you're connecting it to this idea of the becoming of becoming. And I'd like to situate that in relationship to some very concrete personal experiences that I've had. So, like, for example, I remember having long conversations about metaphysics with my grandmother, who was a self-identified Mormon. And she would basically say that, you know, when we die, we go to heaven. She had basically a Platonic view of the let's say the ideas of heaven. And it's basically sort of, you know, I would sort of probe and dig around on this, and she would, you know, basically say it's an eternal space, you know, like you there's no life, there's no death. It's just you're you know, you're there in a perfect being and so forth, floating around with all your loved ones and so forth, like that. But even people who don't have this sort of two world mythology, if we could call it that, even people who had basically a secular orientation would have an object, usually in my experience related to an intimate partner or a loved one, where that partner was basically a surrogate eternal object, in the sense of if they lost that eternal object, they would fall into an abyss, and potentially even to the level of suicide. So there is this way in which our being, the way in which we are as human beings, seems like many people strive for an eternal object to identify with, that would bring some safety, which would bring some security. And maybe that's connected to the way in your sort of metaphysical journey you stumbled upon Alan Watts and the wisdom of insecurity. A lot of people are looking for wisdom in security, and that security turning into, again, kind of, whether it's a secular or a supernatural object, some sort of eternal object which they can identify with. So in that context, it makes a lot of sense that Nietzsche would call the becoming of becoming an abysmal thought, something that's extremely terrifying to confront. In your experience, how do you make sense of this way in which most humans are, whether consciously or unconsciously, searching for an eternal object? And how is it different to live with this idea, deeply understood, what Nietzsche's calling the most abysmal thought, the becoming of becoming?
I think, like, yeah, personally, there's a lot to say there in terms of, I would say, like, for example, I would say I've had glimpses of psychosis when I was 18 years old, where my whole framework of understanding the world just in one moment, literally one moment, fell apart. And it was from that moment, I think, I became interested in saying, okay, who the hell am I if that's happened? How can I even make sense of my being if the object, which I didn't even know what it was because it was just society's object, you know, the big other, the way society taught me to think, and teaches us to think to this very day. But I think in relation to Nietzsche, even in my earlier readings, that the most powerful thing was he would introduce this aspect to the point where he says even scientific thinking, which is the most rational, the most, you know, empirical, it gets to the truth of beings, it understands them, it systematizes them, it places them into structures so we can understand the evolution. And I know you're interested in evolutionary theory, the evolution of humanity. And there are truths there, like we have to negotiate here, you know. But I think Nietzsche's thinking orientates itself around the idea that any attempt to unify our subjective place, and I don't like the word subjective too much because, yeah, anyway, our place in the world, any attempt to unify that with any sense making is itself, or will itself always be, nihilistic. And I think this is important to understand with Nietzsche. Like, he uses the word nihilism in different variations. Some he affirms, some he doesn't affirm. The one that he doesn't affirm But in a way, I think he kind of, in a way, says that it's inevitable, is that we will always have objects of desire. We will always have will. Look at his work when he talks about will to power. And I think when he talks about will to power, he's saying that in a way it's a metaphysical statement that all beings are in the ongoingness of power. And like our will as beings is to increase, to overpower the power that we have in society, in our family relationship, in our relationships with our partners. There's always this you can either call it a historical desire or metaphysical desire, depends where you lie on that spectrum, of creating objects out of things, creating things out of phenomena, and attaching meaning to those things, and founding ourselves upon those things. And we all do this. Like, we do this in our daily habitual lives. We do this with habits. We do this with addictions. We do this with desires. We do this with the future. We do this with the past. The idea is we project onto things sense of meaning, and we coordinate ourselves around them. Nietzsche's constant introduction of, or his announcement of European nihilism, is to say that each and every value is itself, you could even say illusory, because of the fact that every value itself is subject to time, it's subject to change, it's subject to becoming, it's subject to transience. Every value that I think towards anything will always degrade itself. Nietzsche talks about the chemical analysis of the highest values, that you don't even need to do anything. You can just see how the history of Christianity has devolved itself, because it's based itself upon, like, and again, like, I've come through this Christian thing, so I'm always kind of self-critical, but yeah, any idea of the future place, any idea of this, any idea that we can even talk about the fact that we're going to be floating around in the future when we die, modern science, and then Nietzsche's polemic against everything, every value, has taught us that, like, it's just made us critical of how we can even value something like that when it's talking about something beyond life. And I do think, following Vattimo's reading, but following Heidegger's, following my own, Nietzsche takes us even further by showing us how every object is itself subject to becoming. And that is the horror, at least initially. I like Julia Kristeva's work, where she talks about the abject. I think it's called The Horror of something, but the horror of the abject. This word abject, abject, is this emotive response to the insecurity we find in those things that we've tried to find security. So when I tried to find security in the father figure, in the mother figure, in the Pope, I've never done that, but, you know, like in anybody, and the person dies, or you see a contradiction, you know, and you see that there's this difference between my idea of what I thought was good and the event when it happens. There's always this constant contradiction. You could say contradiction, but even contradiction is contradicted, you know. There's a becoming, and I think what Nietzsche does is he wants to bring us to that place where we feel this horror, because for him that's the open space of life, where then with light feet we dance with joy. And I think this is so important in Nietzsche to introduce his diagnosis of European nihilism, is because he wants to teach us Zarathustra's teaching of the Overman. He wants us to glimpse at a possible way of being where we are completely for becoming, where we become aware of even the fact that our notions of becoming are becoming, because for him that is the Dionysian rapture, that is the place of joy, of bliss, and I would say, going back to your comment, the place of God, the place of the Tao, which always brings you to your very present awareness of where you are in the now. But then that doesn't mean, oh, I can't think of the past, I can't think of the future, because for Nietzsche to even create that distinction, you are evaluating beyond becoming, if that makes sense. You're moving beyond becoming. And I think in a way, so when we say like Nietzsche's metaphysics, and again, Heidegger would agree, Nietzsche's promotion of the Zarathustra and what he does in Zarathustra, where he talks about like the character of the Overman, the character of Zarathustra himself, Like I remember reading his section where he speaks to the old woman, and he talks about women and the place of women, and it's like quite hard for us to digest today, because it's like, okay, but what do we mean by this? Like these little moments in Nietzsche's thinking where there's some contradictions, and I think this is how people read Nietzsche, and they quickly put him away because they see him as a 20th century thinker. You know, he's caught in this 19th century, caught in this. We're caught in the image of Nietzsche, but I think if we do follow Nietzsche radically, he brings us to the point where we can encounter the fact that even the position of atheism is dead, because you can't say there is no God, because even that even that opinion is subject to time and change. You see, so there is a radicality, and I would like towards the end to maybe draw that into what he means by the eternal reoccurrence of the same. I think you're, from what we spoke together, you have the opinion as well that there is something about it, what we said, negation of negation, becoming of becoming, that connects to that.
So, like, one of the things that I'm picking up a lot in your speech is this emphasis on time, which I think presupposes in some sense that what Western metaphysical thinking is perhaps more spatially or object oriented. That we think in such a way as to produce spatial objects which have perhaps an unconscious presupposition of being non-temporal. And then we have a sort of negative emotional reaction when that object falls apart. And I'm actually recalling now a line in Thus Spoke Zarathustra where he talks about the difference between mechanical virtues and organic virtues. And he talks about mechanical virtues in such a way as that it's almost like a child playing with a toy. And when the parent takes the toy away or they lose the toy, they start crying and they have a negative emotional affect. Whereas organic virtues are more naturally flowing from the source, let's say. Whereas, of course, the toy, in the case of the mechanical toy, or computer, if you're playing with your computer, is of course not the source. You're the source, and you're projecting yourself into an object, which if it breaks or if you lose it, there's a negative emotional affect. I still remember a day where my computer was stolen and I had a negative emotional affect. It's like, oh shit, like I've lost everything on my computer. So now what I'm trying to get to with this becoming of becoming, and I want to connect it in some way to this overcoming of nihilism, is how can we think more temporally? How is there a way, like, okay, so like one of the problems I have, for example, when I've encountered some Deleuzians in academic context, is that it seems to me like their understanding fixates on becoming. So so that's like a paradox, because then you all you've done is replace the idea of being, which is a fixed idea, with the idea of becoming, which is paradoxically a fixed idea. But how can we train ourselves to think in terms of time? And that, to me, is kind of has a Hegelian problem to it, because one, Hegel I think a lot of what phenomenology of spirit is doing is training us to think in terms of time, because every object fails and it takes you down a path and you think this is the truth and it's not the truth, and you think this is the truth and it's not the truth, until you finally get to the state of absolute knowing, which is objectless. And he says even the time form is discarded. So this kind of gives me the idea of the becoming and the thinking in terms of time. Is there a way in your sort of path that you have stumbled upon this, and how have you responded to it?
Yeah. I think that what you've just said there is the biggest question of all, of everything there is. You know, you've discovered that. Yeah, I'm joking. Yeah, like for me, it's one way of putting that is like, can we stumble upon some kind of absoluteness today, where we don't just reaffirm a value such as becoming and then satisfy ourselves with a kind of philosophical tradition, we write papers about it, we talk about it and stuff, and just then that in itself becomes mechanical. I'm not sure about Deleuze. Last weekend I was at a conference and it was full of Deleuzians, and every paper was amazing. Like it brought a different light onto Deleuze and his thinking of Nietzsche, his thinking of becoming or difference and repetition, notions which my work on Vattimo, he criticizes, doesn't criticize Deleuze, but he talks about difference. So Vattimo wrote a book called The Adventure of Difference, to talk about this fact that there's always a difference of the difference of the difference, to such a degree that we can't even affirm becoming as the new status for being. Because if we do that, we then dry up and fall back into metaphysics. So Gianni Vattimo is a postmodern thinker because he's always aware of this problem of metaphysics, of thinking through notions as if we're going to arrive at some kind of absolute knowing, like an absolute system. And I think this is why Žižek has been so important for me personally, because he's introduced the idea for the first time that Hegel's absolute knowing is not a building up of a system which then we accumulate and place onto the world as if then we know the truth of things. Because of course, Nietzsche's teaching us that this system building is itself mechanical and it will be subject to change. Hegel's system is including negativity into the very core of his system. So when we work through forms and notions and objects, when we have an object in front of us, negativity is there to not overcome the dialectic towards the next step, but to just constantly reveal the inner contradiction of that object as if we understood that it was an object. And that's where we become objectlessness, because we realize that every object was itself objected by us. That's how I've understood Žižek's interpretation of Hegel. And I would say on this point that Nietzsche does the same. Heidegger would shoot me, but I think he does through Heidegger's own later thinking on releasement. I think that Nietzsche, because basically what Heidegger says is that Nietzsche introduces, and he brings some interesting quotes from Nietzsche's later work, where Nietzsche works on the question of becoming to such a degree that becoming becomes the new truth for Nietzsche, you know? And I would say, yeah, like that makes sense. Like if you look at what the eternal reoccurrence of the same is, it's this awareness that because of time, because of the transience of every object, the highest certainty or the permanence is the fact that that becoming is always becoming. And in the event of that becoming, we don't attain because it's not an object to attain. We encounter the event of becoming. And for Nietzsche, that is the place from which we become who we are, who we are, which is the type of being which lives in becoming. And I think there, and this is the point, the reason why there's joy, the reason why there's a dance. I know in his attempt at self-criticism in Birth of Tragedy, so it's like something he added on to his first text, The Birth of Tragedy, later in his life. He talks about his early ambition to create a metaphysics of art, but he also talks about the fact that instead of providing a metaphysics of how we overcome the Socratic ideal, which is like placing the ideas into another world, to look at spatiality and just to presume that every object is fixed forever. Instead, he said, how you should have laughed, how you should have danced. And because I think that's the point. We're so used to this idea of knowing, of determining, of holding onto an object of knowledge and saying that's the truth. And look at like politics. Like I would say I'm a good communist in some ways, but look at politics. Look at how we associate ourselves to ideologies. Žižek's whole critique of ideology is to say that you never escape this objectification of things, but in a way there's a self-awareness that those objectifications, i.e. I'm a communist, i.e. I'm a right-wing, whatever you want to say, all of these self-objectifications are themselves subject to time, to space, to history. Look at Nietzsche's second meditation on the history, the use and value of history, you know? Like it's about bringing out the fact that everything is historically formed and created, and so will be deformed and decreated.
Including historicism.
including
Yeah,
historicism.
exactly. And I think that's something that comes through a lot in your work to me is that, even nihilism debases itself, even atheism debases itself, even historicism debases itself, even becoming debases itself. And in my own way of thinking about this, I guess, is like what I posit to myself as a challenge in my work. I'd be interested to get your feedback on this. Is I think about the evolution of the universe, and I think about how at one point in the evolution of the universe, basically everything was like a subatomic soup. It's like everything is basically like everything is basically like a subatomic plasma, which hasn't yet formed into higher clusters of form. And then at another point in the universe, the example I always give, there are giraffes, there are lions, there are there are naked mole rats, and so forth.
Can't forget those.
And it's actually extraordinarily strange and extraordinarily weird to think about, from the point of view of the universe as a subatomic plasma, how the universe eventually became a universe of naked mole rats and giraffes and stuff. And the question is, for me, and to situate this in the context of Nietzsche, when he says man is a bridge, the human is a bridge, the way we, how he famously opens Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the way in which we laugh at the apes, the overman will laugh at us as ridiculous and absurd. And the question I'm trying to come to is, can we think of an analogous qualitative transformation or generation where you go from something as different as subatomic particles to the biosphere to whatever humans are now, to something that's unthinkable to us at the current moment? And what I'm sort of zeroing in on in our conversation is this capacity to think time, or this, and that the distinction between the overman and the common human of the metaphysical Western civilization is their object orientedness. What's your reaction to this? And the way I think about this is in terms of the being that's thinking with time and really living the becoming almost becomes an alien from the point of view of the normal humans.
No, yeah, well said. I think when you were saying this, I was thinking, like, in a way, the highest possibility for us today to think is to think how we can become what we are already. And I think this is in a way, when you talked about like the overman will look at the last man. So Nietzsche diagnoses like the status of most of society today as the society of the last men, last women, in terms of how we are living in nihilism, kind of aware of it, but just keep on going anyway. Like little mole rats in the desert, like I don't know if they're in the desert, by the way, but we're in the desert. We recognize where we are, and we just kind of get on with it because there seems to be no alternative, So when we think about the future of human evolution, we say, well, and even now with austerity, with everything that's going on, that idea is like, okay, that's the last thing we should be thinking about. But I think what Nietzsche brings us to, is the fact that we are already the destination of the overman. So like, I think this is what he does when he talks about placing Zarathustra as the teacher of the overman. So Zarathustra is not himself yet the overman. It's working out, how do we arrive at this home calling. So I think he uses the word home calling, like the fact that we are to arrive at this destination. I think one thing, and again, it's my interpretation, and I found this through even things like radical theology or negative theology, but more radical theology, where it's saying that there is no destination. You are already where you are. There is no true idea of who you should become, because you are already it. You are already the place from which you are. And I think what Nietzsche teaches us with the will to power is, if we affirm becoming, meaning the eternal reoccurrence of the same, and it will be important to emphasize what eternal means in that point, we're discovering the becoming of our now, of our place, which is where Zarathustra and his prediction advocating of the overman occurs, takes place, because we are already in life. There is no difference between where we are now and the future. It's just the way in which we envision ourselves, you know? And so maybe the next evolutionary phase, and again, by the way, it sounds like from this conversation that I'm skeptical about thinking. I think we are free to think, even if it's illusory, we can think creatively about our possibilities whilst also knowing that those ideas and thoughts are subjectively mediated. But that's also the place of creation and creativity and joy.
Yeah. Well,
So I think, just to finalize
yeah.
what I wanted to say about the thinking, I think maybe the next evolutionary phase of humanity is our ability to think in abstractions about the very failure of abstractions and to see what eventuates in our relationship to being. Because I think that's why nihilism is so necessary today. This is, I think I've had to pass through nihilism, and I'm still passing, and I don't think I will come out of it, because what I'm talking about as an it is not really an object. It's the problem of there not being an object. And I think this is why we are in our Western society now finally orientating ourselves around ideas which have already been maybe in Eastern philosophies for 2000 years, you know, in relationship to the fact that we don't need to do anything.
Right.
We are it. We are life for Nietzsche. We are becoming. And so we are also that eternal, permanent moment where we catch ourselves in that becoming. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in the context of where Nietzsche first introduces the idea of the eternal return of the same in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it's underneath the gateway of the moment, that there are two paths. One represents the past, one represents the future, but they're both under the gateway of the moment, which maybe goes unrecognized sometimes. And actually, one thing I want to focus on is I like the way you said that nihilism is somehow connected to this problem of there not being an object. And again, like in my reading of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, it's this realize absolute knowing is connected to this objectlessness, this positivization of the negativity of the object, that there is no object. And the one thing I was thinking about, like in the context of, like, for example, again, if people are really objectifying something in a very emotionally intimate way, there is, could be done with a sexual partner, could be done with food, like eating your favorite food, right? Like the, a positive object. But like the real horror, I think this is like, to me, like the horrifying idea. And to me, like when I'm thinking about it now, like maybe quasi, at least in a certain way for the first time, is like there's a Žižekian element to it, which is imagine that you get your ideal sexual partner or you have your ideal food and you're not allowed to stop having sex or you're not allowed to stop eating. That's the true horrifying idea.
Yeah.
Like imagine your favorite food is pizza. Okay, you're never allowed to stop eating pizza. And then horror, right? So it's actually, so I think what this opens me up to is the little thought mechanism of overcoming nihilism, which is, or at least passing through nihilism, which is recognizing that all of the objects of your desire fail, connected to this abstraction failing thing, and then being in the negativity of that, and then coming out on the other side of it, which I think, from things you've said and things I've read elsewhere, brings you to a type of life-affirming spaciousness, which is, I think, an openness, which is perhaps also connected to your work with Heidegger, but this problem of, I think that we need to think about ways to communicate to people, especially in their maturation process, especially in their education process, the how this dynamic works, and also the negativity involved in what you think you want. Because I think that's also something I get in Žižek's work a lot, is that what you think you want, you actually don't want. And if you got what you think you want, it would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
Like he
talks about the mistress. So you have your wife, and you have a mistress, and the wife dies, and then you look to the mistress, but the object is unsatiable because the satisfaction is displaced. You're transposing desire in it.
You have the mistress because you're in the relationship with the wife. So you remove the wife, you lose the mistress, because you're setting up a certain. The point is that you're unconsciously setting up a certain model obstacle, whereas if the obstacle is removed, you also lose the desire because you're brought too close to the object of desire.
Exactly.
That's the nightmare.
This relates to I remember the first PhD proposal I put out there was called the weakened objective ideology. If I could just spend 2 minutes talking about weakened, what that means. Gianni Vattimo, who's again part of my PhD research, his main concept is pensiero debole, which means weak thinking, because he would say that every object that is there for us is not really an object, but because we are in the decline of metaphysics, in the decline of this type of thinking, which thinks objects as if they were real entities in and of themselves, knowable, correspondable. In seeing that there's a failure to objects, you can follow Heidegger's thinking and Nietzsche's of the end of metaphysics. How do we think in a post-metaphysical way? Vattimo situates himself in the decline of metaphysics in saying that there will always, for now in this epoch, still be objects there for us. When I say, oh, hi, Cadell, it's Thomas. Oh, okay, nice. We're objectifying. And I think with weak thinking, it's an attitude that we take and bring into our relationships with everything, technology, people, place, future, past, where we are aware of the fact that everything that I'm thinking is thought by me. When I meet a new person and I see them, there can be maybe what Hegel calls self-consciousness, to be aware that I'm the one producing the idea of the person in front of me, which seems like a failure. And that is the place of failure because of desire and the complexity of human relationships and the fact that we want to attribute meaning to somebody new that we meet because that could be the potential, be all and end all of my life. And then there's a failure, and then you're caught in this unreconcilableness of how do I place myself because that person's, it's a mess. But I think with weak thinking, and this is why Vattimo turns to a weak communism, and that's for anybody who's interested in communism and this type of conversation we're having now. It's called hermeneutic communism. It talks about being aware, even in political systems, of the very failure of that system to capture the truth of what is. Instead, we can be pragmatic in some ways. In Hegel, I think one of my supervisors wrote a book called The Other Side of Absolute Knowing, and he finishes the first part of this book talking about Hegel's Napoleon pragmatism, meaning we become aware of the objectless of things, but we can still place objects onto things whilst knowing the transience and the finitude of our interpretations. And I think this relates to Lacan, from my knowledge of Lacan through Žižek and through some others, where he talks about the passing object. We traverse the fantasy of our thinking when we recognize that the thought that we thought is literally an object that passes for us. So we take on a new relationship to objects, to people, to things, where potentially those objects are no longer objects. They are, in the Heideggerian sense, and this now always goes back to Heidegger, are things in their thingingness. So Heidegger makes a distinction between objects and things. And he would say, in a relationship of releasement where you let those beings be, not in terms of willing their releasement, and there's a lot to say here for a different conversation, we encounter the thingliness of the thing for the first time, where it can just be whatever it needs to be for us, including our interpretation. And that's what it means by openness. You can relate that to relationships, you can relate that to objects, food, So if I feel emotional about food, which I have in the past, and I say, oh, I shouldn't eat this, and then I become fixated and I feel guilty and I have a bit, and then I feel complex, and then I eat everything, and then I'm like, oh fuck, I've this objectification.
I know it well.
I think everybody does, and if they're saying no, they're lying. That's my opinion. Because I think we're trained in this way. We're thrown into a society where, well, what's Žižek's t-shirt? It's I would prefer not to, because we're force-fed these desires as if there was an object that can satisfy us at the end of the line,
The Coca-Cola.
The Coca-Cola.
The Snickers bar.
Yeah, like in the desert, and it's satiation.
Yeah.
Like even when I watched that in Žižek's film, I was like, oh, that sounds like, you see the like the bubbles on the outside of the Coke bottle when it's glass, it's not aluminium. You're like, wow, this is incredible, because it's attempted to fill in a lack, which in my opinion, lack only arises as an effect of the type of thinking which has tried to attain an object in the first place. So when you try to attain that object, you'll experience a lack because there was no object. But the biggest question is, and I think this is a question for me and for my future, can we really have a relationship to objects where they are not objects, but beings open that can be what they want to be for me, and I can be,
Right. I think that brings us back to perhaps a question that, I mean, maybe is it's ideal that I could ask you this question, because in my understanding of Heidegger's work, his big project is to not just to deconstruct the Western metaphysical project, but also to bring us back to being with a big B. Is that correct?
Oh yeah.
And so in the context of his project to bring us back to being with a big B, how do you connect it to this idea, which I quite like from Vattimo, of the weakened ideology? Is there a connection there?
Yeah. I would say Vattimo's done an amazing job I think Vattimo, there's a nice word he uses to talk about someone called Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer. He talks about the urbanization of Heidegger, meaning relating what Heidegger calls the historicity of being, meaning the fact that all of our ideas towards being are purely historical, meaning all of our subjective interpretations of what being is. And by the way, being is such a weird question today because, like Heidegger said, we've forgotten being. So when you try and introduce this question of being, it's like, what? Like, we're in nihilism and we're not in the question of being. Heidegger, the reason why he's focused on the question of being is because he sees how in the complete forgetfulness of it, because the being is now nothing, there is an event which we can call being. And the reason why Vattimo comes in is Vattimo urbanizes this by radicalizing this, by saying, yes, in every instance, when we think about the being of all beings, the ground from which we stand, like what is being, which in the early Greek philosophies was the central question. Is it fire? Is it water? Is it God? What is it? Heidegger for me has become so important in the last 4 months because he is not, in the same way for you and Žižek and Hegel has been misread, and like we should revive Hegel. I would also claim Heidegger has been very, very misread, even by me, for the last 8 years of my life, because the question of being, why the question of being? Why can't we just forget this? And I can relate this to Nietzsche, maybe. The question of being, okay, you can't, maybe not the question, but the event of being is very, very, very similar to what Nietzsche reads as the eternal recurrence of the same. If I become fully, I don't want to use the word existentially, but I'll use it, existentially aware of becoming, I'm aware of like the fact that things change and that my perception changes in every instance, and I become aware of the fact that everything's passing, everything, the car passes by, the person passes by, and I'm aware of becoming. Heidegger would say it's in that really radical deconstruction. I don't like to use that word because that's a different tradition in French philosophy. You can say annihilating without the A, not annihilating, but annihilating, where it's a case of not destruction, but just letting be. It's in that moment when we encounter being. And by the way, I did a presentation last weekend on releasement in Heidegger to try and contextualize Vattimo and Žižek. And I realized to talk about this is using a whole Heideggerian language, which is really hard sometimes, because we're talking about things such as releasing, the difference between annihilating. And it's tough because I think, again, we think as if we think in a way as if things are objects. For Heidegger, it's the releasement of those objects when we realize that those objects were not even there in the first place, that we not only encounter beings in their way to be, we encounter the very letting be of being itself. So in the later work of Heidegger, he would say being is the event where things are annihilated. In Nietzschean terms, life, what he wants to affirm, is the very event where there's a becoming of the becoming, where we recognize even our notion of what is passing is also passing. And it's in that event of that happening that there is life, if that makes sense. There's a gap because I acknowledge a failure, and this is very Žižekian. I acknowledge a failure, and in the failure, in the recoil, so he wrote, Žižek wrote a book called The Absolute Recoil. In my recoil away from that object, I experience a gap. That gap is being for Heidegger. And by the way, this is my reading. It's very naive. The eternal reoccurrence of the same for Nietzsche. And maybe you can even say absolute knowing for Hegel. And by the way, I'm not to say this now is not like it's too big, but I have this intuition.
No, it's interesting.
Yeah, there's
it's bold thinking. Yeah, it's bold thinking. I mean, not that we can synthesize or something all of these thinkers into the gap, but also to sort of make some sense of the fact that I think I think maybe this cut we're making with post-Kantian philosophy, that there is sort of a common observation or ethos or project at work here, which does have to do with time, which does have to do with the way in which we have to raise our thinking to the reality of time or the reality of becoming, and this relationship consequently with deconditioning our object-oriented view with seeing from the perspective of failure. Is definitely something that I see in Hegel. It's definitely something that I see in Nietzsche. I'm not, I mean, you'd be more the expert on Heidegger than me, but the thing with Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which stands out with this failure mode view, is that it seems to me like from the very beginning of Zarathustra coming down from the mountain and talking to the people, is that he's emphasizing striving for greatness inclusive of inevitable failure. In other words, strive for greatness. Don't be ashamed if you fail. Don't be ashamed even if you die for your project. That's greatness. Greatness is that you strive for greatness inclusive of the inevitable failure. And I think he says that is the loneliest vision. So to me, it's like understanding this stuff is not necessarily, I mean, I think there is an intellectual hurdle to understanding this stuff, no question about it.
Of course,
but it's much more an emotional hurdle, like in terms, and I think that, I don't know if this is going too far, but the gap between continental philosophy post-Kant and analytical philosophy post-Kant seems to me to involve this difference between, it's not just an intellectual gap that we have to cross, but also an emotional gap, to really understand being as an event in which things are annihilated is like not just an intellectual gap. So what do you make of the emotional weight of what post-Kantian philosophy throws at us?
Yeah, I think what
enormous.
It throws, enormous and very broad. But I think what it centers on is what you've said, like with Kant, he introduced the problem of time, of relativity. So he followed Newton's idea that all beings in their being as they move are affected by their relative position in space, which means their mass. And this introduced the very problem of, I think Heidegger makes a good point on how Aristotle had this idea that beings just follow their course. Human beings are made and we follow our typical framework of being, and we have possibilities within that framework. The moon circulates around the earth according to its preordained, prearranged truth, its eternal circumference, Whereas Newton came in and said, well, actually everything is dependent upon its place in space and time, more space. But what Kant does is he introduces this into philosophy, where he says, what are the conditions for the possibility of my knowledge? The first thing he introduces is time, which is his critique of pure reason. It's this problem of, if I am here in this moment now, how do I know what something is? And Hegel radicalizes this. So some people would say that he fulfills Kant by introducing history. So there are no absolute values. Everything is historically embedded and changing and shifting. But the moment within that change is an absolute knowing, which recognizes its own position as that knowing. Yeah, I've kind of lost what I wanted to say there. But okay, in terms of like the continental,
the emotional
the
challenge
emotive,
here, because it's
and
not
I
just
think,
can we communicate this intellectually to people so that they can, I don't know.
No, yeah. So like the history of Western philosophy is to try and communicate it to the people. Like Zarathustra's role in a general sense is to communicate this to the people, to announce the death of God as the death of the object of God, as if it was other, you know. I think personally, looking at the history of philosophy, my experience, even in the university and even society at large, we have this emotive response to nothingness, to like on a subjective level, it's very a hard thing to confront nothingness, you know, because we're thrown into a society where we've based our securities upon things. I think in the university, talking about nothingness and the event of being as the annihilating of all things towards an event, it's not useful according to the framework of institutions today, because there's no utility which can be gained from this. And again, utility is a word that originates from this idea of objects as producing something valuable. Talking about nothingness seems to be the most irrelevant thing in the world. I'm reading as well Heidegger's Country Path Conversations. It's very nice. It has the kind of structure like Zarathustra in a way. It's three thinkers. One is a scientist, one is a scholar, one is a guide. And the opening part is about the scientist's problem of speculating and of concerning ourselves with nothingness. He says, what's the point? It's useless. I want to know hardcore facts and I want to know how they relate to each other. And that's all that knowing can do. So
It
you'll find
sounds
the
like
university structure, there's an emotion against talking about nothingness, because of the fear of nothingness. It's a, you know, we're talking about nothingness, like ending, like finality, non-being, like, you know, we're all, as Heidegger would say, we're all beings towards death. That's the highest possibility for us. And it's a motive. Like, I don't want my framework to be disintegrated based upon the fact that one day I might not be here. Like, that's scary. Like, I in my anxious moments as a human being, that's what creeps up, you know. When I've had a bit too much wine and I lay down in bed, that sometimes crops into my mind, you know, like, okay, how do I know the truth of something? And I realize that it's subjective. I realize that maybe there's just nothing. How can I even know that nothing, you know? So there's an emotivity. But the problem is, and I think this is what Nietzsche does so well, is he says, even in trying to escape this, so I think he talks about the security of the highest values, in trying to escape, and I think for Nietzsche, time is the same as nothing, because time for Nietzsche is transience in my reading. It means the coming to be and the passing on, the coming and the going, which is situated on this idea of things become no thing. If we place our security in things, in objects, if institutions only exist to promote utility, the effect will be what's happening today, which is a negative form of nihilism, a negative form of postmodern thinking, which, what's the word? It accepts certain, it delimits, it limits knowing to certain junctures and positions and says, okay, we can't do much, but we just have to get on with it. Speculative questions concerning life, death, the meaning, and the possibility of being an overman are all just speculative ideas. Let's focus on the hard stuff. There will always be a lack, you know, because we continue in that way of thinking, which pretends like, okay, there's a failure, but we'll just get on with objects. And look at the world today. Look at how, like, climate change, our relationship to others, you know, the re-strengthening of ideologies. Yeah, it's pure emotivity. But I would say on the other side, there's also a possibility for a different relationship, you know, to each other, to the world.
Yeah, I think that's I think what we're trying to crawl towards in some way. And I do think that this emotional recoil against thinking about nothing, the way you described the scientist in Heidegger's conversations, reminded me of what I was mentioning about Lawrence Krauss as the physicist who says philosophers are experts on nothing in a dismissive way, like, oh, that's not very useful. Again, this focus on utility, what I come to is in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, he dialecticizes utility because it doesn't in itself provide self-insight. And that self-insight has to be included in the utility in order for it to have any dialectical sense. And also in the preface of the phenomenology, he connects the void or the disparity between the subject and the object as the soul of the thing. So it's like this nothingness, or or in Heidegger's term, this highest possibility of being towards death, is yes, it provokes a lot of anxiety, but at the same time, it seems to be the only way to live a life which is worth living in some sense. It's just like the opposite of nihilism. So it's like this promotion of utility on the one hand, which points towards a negative form of nihilism, and this need for the cultivation of self-insight, which cannot be sort of like objectively observed from the outside, towards, I think, the overcoming of nihilism in some ways. And then that overcoming of nihilism, I think, hopefully even the term nihilism would disappear. It appears at our historical moment as a symptom or something like that. But that it involves, I think, becoming, I don't want to say better, but like, yeah, I mean, an overman type of being, in the sense of what we think we want to go back to in terms of like the world that Nietzsche deconstructs, the world that Heidegger annihilates, and so forth, is not a world we would want to be with anyway. It's kind of like, you know, like when we have these fantasies of like make America great again, it's like a retroactive fantasy of a past that never really existed, and actually you don't want to go back there.
Exactly.
You know, like I love a reporter who asks so one of the Trump supporters about make America great again is like, what exact time are you referring to? And you know, whatever date you pick, you could pick out something, of course, abysmal and horrible and stuff.
Yeah. But I mean, this is the type of forgetfulness that our society and world is malaised with. You know, we forget the fact that we've never been at home. In our ideas, like what's the word? Like the uncanny, to be in a position where we crave for a return to something, but we've never been there in the first place, and what we thought was there was actually, to use Nietzsche's expression, like a figment of the imagination, you know. But then maybe that's the point. It's to bring us now to where we are here and now. Of course, maybe that's a bit different in terms of politics and making America great, because where America is right here, right now, it's not a good situation, you know. But I think this is the point. It's about our relationship in being aware that there is no ideal, as in the picturesque ideal that we paint for ourselves and work towards. That's illusionary. But I think, again, Vattimo comes in and says, fine, you can unmask the illusion, but that illusion has an effect. But we can paint pictures whilst being aware that it's just an illusion, and change our relationship to society, to politics, to our individual expression, to being in a relationship. If I know that my partner or anybody is just my idea, I can be next to them as being aware of my subjectivity and affirming that, because that's where creation is. And I say creation, I don't like the word because it has this idea that I'm a subject who creates something, but there's a creativity, a possibility, potentiality. One word that comes up a lot in a lot of post-Heideggerian thinkers is inexhaustibility. So the inexhaustibility of interpretation, and that's the place of eternity, is in the fact that we're here doing this in the here and now, you know.
Maybe that's a place we should focus on a little bit more, because I know you wanted to connect how in your work, you connect the idea of the eternal return or the eternal recurrence with becoming, which in my reading, like when I first encounter these ideas, I'm like, there's a contradiction here. How does this go together? How does, like, for example, at the start of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he says, there's no God, there's no eternity, there's just time and loss. But then as you work through Thus Spoke Zarathustra, actually, you do confront something like an eternity, and you do confront something like a perfect moment, and you do so there's a paradox here at work. So in your work and in your view, how do you connect the ideas of eternity, the eternal recurrence, and becoming?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of I think because I read it recently, is the attempt at self-criticism in The Birth of Tragedy, which is again was added on later in Nietzsche's life. He talks about the fact that wait, I actually have. Let me see if I can find it. He talks about. No, okay, it's going to take too long. He talks about the unknown God, and he talks about for the overman. So he uses like the Dionysian, but you can, I would say, connect it to the overman, just his earlier interpretation. He talks about that the Dionysian is in relation to an unknown God with a small g. It means, and I think this is what he means when he talks about the dance and the joy and the ability to interpret what that could be, which is why it's unknown, and maybe it will always be unknowable. But I think that God can mean just the literally the space in which we are being. But the big thing for me as well, and I think this is more connected to how we overcome nihilism in Nietzsche. Because I think the problem is with all of this is we can say, okay, let's just affirm life, let's just continue on. It's about not even seeing nihilism as a problem. We can just get on. I think the problem is there is this inkling, this kind of pre-understanding, maybe because of our history, where we say, well, I still would like to know if I can call myself a Christian, like I still have that thing. Like I would say, like if someone said this, I would say no, because I'm not associated to any religious idea of self-identifying as a Christian moral person, like that's now gone in my imagination because of people like Nietzsche. But I still have this question: is there something about this? Is there a truth to this? Is there a truth to absolute knowing? Is there a truth to the reoccurrence of the same, to becoming, to transience? Is there something about transience? Is there something about is there something about nothing? Is there a meaning to nothing which we can which is unconcealed to us, to use Heidegger's language, in our questioning thinking about nothingness? And I would say yes, but it's a meaning which itself is subject to becoming. And this is maybe what my work in my research concludes with, in a very unbold way, very academic way, because I have to keep it tidy and neat and not be bold, because you're not allowed to be bold. And I get why. Like, we're young, we're both very young. Maybe when we're 65 and we've had there is something to be said anyway. The eternal
No, I get you.
Yeah, no, yeah. But like I also like it. Like I remember in my undergraduate I studied law, and I had my final dissertation was on the philosophy of law, and I was like laying down a metaphysics of why law is,
Right. Yeah, there's this.
my supervisor was
I
like, slow
know.
down, like come on,
Yeah.
like
I know, and I encounter that as well in probably a lot. I'm sure my professors encountered that in me, and I also encounter that in younger people writing and stuff. There is
yeah.
a way in which you have to slow down a little bit, and there is something to be said for that. But I was wondering if you could go into a little bit in a way that might make it very clear for the viewers how you're connecting becoming and the eternal return.
Okay.
Because you're connecting it there, and I want to get at what you're trying to say here, because I think it's really important.
I think it comes back to, and I'll try and say it in simpler terms, because I know I can get lost in my own thinking of what I'm thinking and say, okay, that makes sense to me, which we all do in every respect. So the idea is, like, if everything is transient, if everything comes to be and passes on of itself, you could say, like, I'm here now and I will be today, hopefully. and then there's a tomorrow. And so Nietzsche talks about the it was, the here. So he calls like the formerly, the now, and the what will come to be. This is time for him, but all of this relates to transience, meaning becoming. So everything is in a state of becoming. This is literally the essential thinking of Nietzsche. This is what he's affirming. He's affirming the fact that everything is in a process of becoming. And I think we really need to get with that aspect of what he's trying to say. Otherwise, everything else just seems like a collection of, aphorisms and maxims. The eternal aspect for me, in my postmodern reading, which is the opposite of what eternity is, because in postmodernism you can't talk about eternity, you can't talk about absoluteness, because they're dogmatic ideas towards being. Everything is relative, everything is contingent, everything is just a product of the specter of society. The eternal aspect for me is when we and I would say, okay, me and my reading of Nietzsche, and also the Heideggerian of Nietzsche that I really enjoy, when we recognize that everything is in a state of becoming, we're also destined to recognize that my idea of becoming, and so even my idea of everything which is an object for me or a thing for me, is also subject to becoming. It's also subject to transience. And this goes back, and the eternal aspect is directly tied to what we said before with Hegel, in my opinion, although different. But there's still this moment, I think, where permanence enters into becoming when I recognize that my idea of becoming is becoming. Because then I find myself in the moment in which that event of becoming happens. And it's the moment which is the rapture of the Dionysian. The Dionysian, I forgot the word he uses, like swing, or the laughter and the rapture, I think it was, where the music, and again, like look at Nietzsche's later work when he talks about music, when he talks about philology, like the body is a huge thing, because what he's bringing us to is the fact that and this is why he criticizes idealism. So in his early work all the way through to his later, like in Ecce Homo, it's like every other page he criticizes idealism, because he would say it's a form of thinking which, even in talking about becoming and staying with just the idea of becoming, is ignoring the becoming of that idea. So what he's bringing us back to is the event of the coming of the idea of becoming. Like, okay, that makes sense. I saw a car go past me, so now becoming must be the truth because that car has gone. Okay, my loved one, my father, my mother was here, and now they're not here. There's something called becoming. It's not just like static objects that are eternal in and of themselves. So there's a recognition. It's common sense, especially today. Like you said, in the past, everything was about space. Then it became about time and transience and finitude, death, and it's problematized everything. Again, the eternal aspect is the moment when I'm here now, experience becoming, that I'm aware that my notion of that becoming has to be subject to its own failure, in a way. Although I don't like to use that all the time. I like to use the word failure in the sense of the metaphysics. One last thing, which I think might help, and it might be a nice further reading for some people who are listening. Gianni Vattimo talks about the fact that everything that's thought is an interpretation. So he follows a type of philosophy called hermeneutics, and he situates himself as a hermeneutic nihilist, because he says that every interpretation that we have about anything is always an interpretation, which for some thinkers, I know it sounds way too dogmatic, but then he would introduce what Nietzsche did. But even me saying this is an interpretation, and I catch a failure in that moment, which affirms the fact that it's an interpretation. Heidegger says the way to be of being is releasement or annihilation. You can maybe interchange that a little bit. So that I say, okay, I can't know anything about being then. And it's in my releasing of that idea that I had towards being that I encounter the event of being. So even if my notion of becoming is itself subject to its own becoming, in that becoming, and this is very abstract, in that becoming, sorry, I'm experiencing the event. And I think it's that space of the event which is eternal for Nietzsche, because it's happening in the now. And for him, so is the past. The past is always in the now. The future is always in the now. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's also in that now that we see how everything around us, past, future, all of my illusions, all of my idealisms, is begot or happens from that place. And I think this is Nietzsche's move to the body. It's Nietzsche's move to where he finds himself, you know, in society, in the world. And I think this is why he comes down from the mountain, because he's enjoying his rapture, he's enjoying his Dionysian swing, but he wants to announce this to people, that all of your illusions are illusions. But in knowing that, you can also then encounter the unknown God. You know?
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, a lot of that. I mean, I like the way you're coming to terms with and making sense of all of that. It does seem incredibly related to Hegel to me, but of course, that I'm biased in that way. I think one of the interesting questions that I want to ask you is related to the way in which you're talking about Nietzsche's interpretation of the Dionysian as
Okay.
as the unknown God, as in, you know, enjoying his Dionysian rapture. I had a talk when I had a talk with Layman Pascal. We had and Thomas Hammelrick as well. We talked a little bit about this. And Layman wanted to emphasize that throughout Nietzsche's career, he evolved to the point where he wanted to show the way in which the Dionysian and the Apollonian were sort of dependent on each other, and they needed each other, and that trying to, in some sense, bring the Dionysian into the Apollonian, and sort of critiqued sort of Western metaphysics and stuff like that for being too Apollonian and forgetting about the Dionysian. And in my talk with Thomas Hammelrick, we had he was giving the idea that really this tension between Nietzsche and Girard does have something important related to the Dionysian, because he says Girard sweeps the Dionysian under the rug, whereas Nietzsche just brings out the Dionysian but doesn't really think about how it could be or how it should be contained necessarily by the Apollonian. So in your relation to Nietzsche and in the way you think about Nietzsche, how do you think about this relationship between the Dionysian and the Apollonian?
Yeah, that's it's nice that this has come up for the third time lucky. I side with my reading from Vattimo on this aspect, and I read The Birth of Tragedy this year again, actually, just to refresh my mindset, because there are questions concerning, through Vattimo, the problem of reconciliation. How do we reconcile these two mythological entities? Because for Vattimo, both the Dionysian and the Apollonian are themselves notions, interpretations of the event of what they're talking about. So for Vattimo, nothing needs to be done about this, because what Nietzsche's talking about is the very present possibility of who we already are. So like, this is what it means to become who we already are. And I think, again, it becomes quite notional when we say, okay, it's about reconciling these aspects of, on the one hand, this rupture and a rapture with the Dionysian, where all forms are dispelled into their own becoming. We see the transience of the dance, we see the finitude of every dancer, and there's a rapture, you know, it's like a frenzy. That's the word I was thinking before. On the other side, we have logos, we have thinking, we have rationality, we have, and I like how my intuition when I read it this year was the fact that when he talks about the perversion of this relationship with Western philosophy in its prioritization of the logic, of truth, of the object that we can attain through knowledge, what he's doing in critiquing this is to show us how there's you can say, like, this word onefold. Both were always already unified. It's just we forgot that aspect. And I think this maybe goes back to what he's promoting in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he's talking about become who you are. We don't need to attain the perfect balance between the two. It's about remembering that we are already a frenzied being who is in life, who is life, who also thinks in abstractions. And this was a big thing for me. I think when we first spoke, I think it was the end of last year or the beginning of this year, I sent you something through, and it was a few notes on idealism and Nietzsche. And like, it seems like Nietzsche's always criticizing the ideal, the logic, the truth. And this paper was to say, actually, even he recognized that thinking, like interpretation, knowing, is itself life. You can't just negate it. You can't just throw it away. Abstraction, and I had a nice conversation last weekend. We talked about like anti-abstractionism, because we all kind of are anti-abstractionists. Like, we want to return to life as it is, not like the idea of it. But and this is very Hegelian, the idea of its failure is also when we see that both idea and life was already unified, you know? I think Hegel talks about this when he talks about the unity of being and nothing. Like, we only pass through the idea of it to realize that it's already who we are. So in the Nietzschean sense, and again, this is my biased reading. Everything I've said today is always a biased interpretation, but I think this is where it's productive. With Nietzsche's affirmation of life, he's affirming both, not as something that we as subjects need to attain, but to become who we are, in seeing that we are, or at least potentially, capable for that type of being. And again, this passes through nothingness. It passes through transience, which is the horror. But in the horror, we see the bliss of the unification of things that we thought were divided. And this is, for me, what I think is very subjectively important, is maybe even the unification of being, God, existence, spirit. And I think that in a way overcomes nihilism for me, you know? I recognize that my interpretation of the Dionysian and the Apollonian are themselves both dichotomized by me. But when I annihilate them and say, okay, enough of those because they're both illusionary, I stumble upon the fact that I'm also a being in the world who is coming to be in every moment. And that's the place of maybe spirit, the empty space of spirit. You can't determine what that is, you know, because it's empty. But that's also where Heidegger would say we are dwelling. And we can build as well with ideas, with notions, with concepts. We can propose political programs to better people, you know, but whilst being aware that it's an image, to use Nietzsche's word. It's art.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Which might be one of the most important, if not the most important things in the world, this this image and this this whatever. The metaphysics that's coming to my mind when you're describing your relationship to the Apollonian and the Dionysian is actually a principle that I enjoy in Less Than Nothing, which is one divides into two. And so, like, when you're describing how, the Apollonian and the Dionysian are dichotomized by me, but I can't just annihilate them.
Yeah.
You know, like, because I'm still a being in the world, and that there's something here in the one splitting into two. If we focus on the split as opposed to the two, I think that's where the real interesting thing is, because that's where you get to the epistemological failure. And in Žižek's project, what he calls the ontological impossibility. In the ontological impossibility being this egoic tendency to want to unify the two into one, instead of focusing on the split. And the thought that came to my mind while you were speaking on that way is that maybe that's actually a useful way, and probably I've modeled this in the Sex, Masculinity, and God book in a similar way, but that's an interesting way to think about men and women, because when you dichotomize men and women, there's something too simplistic about that. You can fall into sort of cheap representations of man and woman as general categories. But when you just annihilate them, also you fall into problems. So, like, there's a way in which, if we focus on the split and then the epistemological failure and the ontological impossibility within that split, I think this is something. And if we can become the types of knowers, if we can become the types of minds that are have moved through the emotional anxiety that comes with really understanding that idea. I think that's, I don't know, at least for me, that's sort of like where I see it pointing in an interesting direction. But I think in terms of like not ending the conversation, but like winding down the conversation is like sort of regrouping on this concept of overcoming nihilism and situating it perhaps in relationship to some of the major themes we've discussed about already in your work. Might be interesting. And like the concept we haven't had a complete, maybe we've been talking around it, but seems to me to be central is in one of your papers, you talk about not just Western metaphysics, but Western desire being about conquering the thing in itself. And that like it seems like a lot of what philosophy after Kant has been wrestling with in terms of time, in terms of transience, in terms of becoming, is to get us out of this mentality of trying to conquer the thing in itself and more like be with the thing in itself as the thing in itself. Like we're with the thing in itself, but we are the thing in itself, and somehow think from that point of view. What do you think that means for the future of Western society, if that word makes any sense? And how do you relate to this in your life?
Okay. Nietzsche's come up, so I'm going to try and refer to Nietzsche a bit first, and then maybe talk about how it relates to my thinking and my attempt to think what thinking means to me, what I see in my life in a world. But I think Heidegger's text, "Who is Nietzsche's Zarathustra," which I would recommend for anybody watching this who's interested in what we're saying. He speaks about how, and I didn't really think of it before until I read this, was how Nietzsche categorizes the history of Western metaphysics, the history of philosophy, the history of our Western culture, and the history of the desire of our culture as being founded and infected and subsisting in what he calls the spirit of revenge. Maybe you've touched on it in your reading of Das Werk Zarathustra. And for Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, the spirit of revenge is that attitude that we have in relationship to objects, including what we take as to be things in themselves, meaning like the essential thing of every object. The spirit of revenge is that attitude towards things where, because we categorize everything, i.e., for example, we as human beings are beings in the world, we are related to other beings that are also there, but because we're superior, because we can think things, we thus have like a different relationship to them compared to them. And what this means is we have, according to Nietzsche, according to Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, but also it makes sense in Nietzsche's line of thinking, the way we relate to beings and to objects and to thinking is in a spirit of revenge. We want to overpower those beings. We want to subject those beings. We want to categorize and implement this notion of dominance. Like if you look at how we treat the world today, it's in this position of dominance because we quickly determine what the world is and what the world can give us in terms of resources, in terms of utility, in terms of space, in terms of, productivity, all of these technological notions, to use Heidegger's word, that define modern, especially modern thinking, is the spirit of revenge. In Heidegger's text, he talks about how this is so directly connected to becoming, to the eternal reoccurrence of the same, because it's this spirit of revenge and its distillation, its taking away, that we are bridged to the overman. This is literally in Das Werk Zarathustra. Like it's of such high importance because this spirit of revenge bases itself upon ideas that categorize things and places things into its correct position. And that's the very problem. That's what nihilism means. It means to attribute value to things in themselves, to dominate those things, and just to presume that, okay, job done. We know the truth. I know who you are. I know what this is. And we go from there. To connect that to nihilism, nihilism shows us that that's an impossibility, because we can't dominate things in themselves, because even perhaps those things in themselves were never things in themselves. Science can do a good job of getting to something, but it's always a determination. It's always a particular perspective that uses tools and mediums to get to that. But that's a different conversation. And some scientists who are listening will probably shoot me already. Yeah, sorry. The spirit of revenge is a categorization of that thinking which wants to dominate.
And why do you think it's there, that spirit of revenge? I know from, like, in the conversations I had with Thomas, it was because in Christian metaphysics that they try to avoid revenge in terms of when you're resentful. They try to avoid the spirit of revenge. But if you like, the idea is, I think, if you can't get revenge, or sorry, he's saying that Christianity tries to prevent revenge, but if you can't get revenge, then you become resentful. And so then there's this culture of resentment or something like that. So, like, but the way he comes back to it is it's always back to this violent urge, which I guess comes back to Girard, which is the scapegoat mechanism and the things hidden from the beginning of time, about this violent urge and impulse we have. What do you think about this?
That's an interesting point, because it's the question of whether do we need a scapegoat as human beings who will revenge. So, like, for some people, human beings are shit. We're not good. We are not capable of functioning outside of the will to power. We're not capable of functioning outside of this mechanism, the scapegoat mechanism, where, because we can't accuse, we have to then accuse one person, which then refreshes the whole system. That's my interpretation of Girard.
We hide in a mob. When we're accusing.
And that satisfies our contentment to say,
Dionysian.
okay, that's done. Now we can continue on in the next form of this process.
I see it as like an unconscious Dionysian.
Okay. Yeah, like the rapture and
a way it's a rapture of the mob.
Yeah. Okay. That's nice. Like to symbolize something, and then I think the biggest question for me, and I think this is the question for Nietzsche, is it possible to move beyond the spirit of revengeance? And in this text with Heidegger, it's really interesting because he mentions Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer's use of a particular form of Buddhism, where Schopenhauer would say that we need to stop willing. That's the only way that we're going to overcome the spirit of revenge. Like, we literally need to stop willing. But then the problem is, if you will to stop willing, you're still willing.
Yeah, that's what I read from Nietzsche.
Exactly.
That Nietzsche's criticisms of Schopenhauer is even the will to stop willing is a will, which is, I think, Lacan's criticism of Buddhism, which is your desire to stop desiring is itself a desire.
This is also a problem in nihilism. The attempt to overcome nihilism through abstractions, through thinking, creates the type of thinking which is nihilistic. So when you try to overcome something notionally, what you're trying to overcome is itself a notion, and you're stuck. So my first supervisor, Ashley Woodward, he wrote a book called Nihilism in Postmodernity, and basically the second half is working through postmodern nihilism and introducing this problem of overcoming the desire to overcome, and then you're bound in this trap. Nietzsche, according to Heidegger, says it's only when we get with becoming that we realize that what is to be willed, and this is Nietzsche's will, what is to be willed is a will for the not just becoming, but the eternal in becoming, a willfulness for the eternal reoccurrence of the same. This is the highest will, and this is why he points to life affirmation, because if we go back to what we said before, and it's very abstract and nuanced, but the eternal in the eternal reoccurrence is the event of becoming. And what needs to be willed is the very gap, to go back to what you said about the split between man and woman. It's the gap itself between the failure of dichotomizing things, which would draw us away from becoming. It's to affirm the very gap in which there's been that failure. And I think that's how we move away from, and I'm not an expert on Girard. I know some people who are, again, they would shoot me. and this, I think this is the problem. Like if we categorize beings as a particular way of being, i.e., we need scapegoats, it makes sense historically. If we then affirm that as like a position of all beings throughout history, and I'm not sure many people do this, but we're sliding into a value and evaluation of beings again. And this is the postmodern side of me, which is a bit too cynical, and Žižek doesn't like this, like, okay, you can't say that because, but I think that, yeah, I think you
Well,
get it.
I think it's interesting to connect this to Girard in the sense of affirming the gap in things, because I feel like where the whole scapegoat mechanism operates is on a vengefulness for the lacking object, that or the lacking other,
resentment.
Resentment. And so I do think that in this, and also in this sort of emphasis that you have here on when we intellectualize or try to overcome nihilism through abstraction, it fails. I think that's why I was trying to emphasize that in continental philosophy, that we're presented with something about self-insight that's emotional, that is going through anxiety, going through, it's really a change. It's not any particular content that you need to learn, but it's rather a change in the very way that you are as a knower that has to change. And I do think that that's connected to the gap, and that's connected to the split between ultimately man and woman, where the intimate energy is circulating, and also where creation circulates. Not that I create, but that's where new children come. So I think that's literally, new beings and life and stuff like that. So I think this is really practical at the end of the day. And so, Thomas, this has been really interesting. I would just want to maybe say, do you have any sort of final thoughts for the viewers? Do you have any final thoughts on the idea of overcoming nihilism in the context of this conversation, with your emphasis on Nietzsche, Heidegger, Vattimo, your ongoing work, that might be sort of salient for them to take home after this dialogue?
Okay, yeah. No, thanks again for having me on. It's been a pleasure. I apologize if it's been too abstract, but to be a little bit more abstract, I think the place of, again, maybe overcoming is the wrong word. Vattimo talks about the difference in German between overcoming and twisting, where you're not annihilating nihilism, because that's impossible, because what you're trying to get rid of is nothing. You can't get rid of it. It's about, like you said, changing our relationship to it, maybe by just seeing that it's not really an it. And this is not Heideggerian, this is more postmodern, to see how nihilism itself is a notion that can be accomplished. And this is, so like my website's, the thing at the top is called Achieving Nothingness. So nothingness can be achieved by knowing that there's nothing to achieve. And there's a play of words here, by opening ourselves up to the fact that nothingness is productive, it has an effect, it's meaningful in the type of thinking that we've been thrown into. But in relation to the openness and the potential for creativity, and also perhaps the potential for absoluteness, Nietzsche's eternity, if we really pass through this notion of nothing, what Hegel would call the abstraction of nothingness, we can perhaps encounter an event, and whatever that event is for you, enjoy it, And I think that's the openness, that's the spirit. Yeah, that's all I can say, and that's all I need to say for now, I think. So
amazing. So again,
me.
I would emphasize to go check out Thomas Winn's website. I like that little phrase that you have on your site there: achieving nothing, nothing needs to be achieved.
It's very graceful.
Yeah,
like you don't need to do anything.
A good Christian.
Yeah, good Christian. No. There is something there. Like, if there's any remnants from that past period, and if there's any chance that I would call myself a Christian, it's a very radical theology where you do not have to do anything to be anyone, because you are already who you are. And that's completely fine, even with your lack, even with your objectless desire for objects, Even in the contradiction, there's still an openness for everybody.
The ultimate anti-Jordan Peterson there. No picking yourself up by picking yourself up by the bootstraps and
But I learned recently that that's literally an impossibility. Like you literally cannot pick yourself up by the bootstraps, and that's why that phrase was invented, because it was like a contradiction of terms to say you can't do it, but try, and you'll know that you fail. And what's that? That goes back to your. I've read something.
Well, I think it's. I think I would connect that to Žižek's epistemological failure and ontological impossibility. That he talks about bootstrapping as an impossibility, but an impossibility in a positive sense.
Yeah.
Like, but anyway, that's
to encounter nihilism, but then maybe to encounter what nihilism means for openness, maybe even absoluteness. Maybe who knows?
Yeah, for another time, perhaps.
Oh yeah.
I just want to emphasize before we wind down here that this is all a part of a larger conversation called the Nietzsche Dialogues. I've had a conversation with Paul Robson on Nietzsche versus Christianity, Layman Pascal on his own version of Nietzsche, which you can find on the channel now, and also a conversation with Thomas Hamelrich on mimetic rivalry, putting Girard into conversation with Nietzsche. And here we've tried to talk about overcoming nihilism with Thomas Winn. And next week, we're going to be having 2 dialogues, one on Nietzsche on women with Raven Connolly and Pamela von Sabeljar, and the future of Nietzsche with philosopher Alexander Bard. So look out for that. The Nietzsche Dialogue series continues to go on. And this is all a build up to a course that I'll be leading on Philosophy Portal on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's going to be a summer-long course, 9 weeks, 6 different classes, and 3 different tiers you can sign up on in regards to, there's a recorded version of the course, a live version of the course, and a one-on-one version of the course. So if you're interested in diving deep into understanding Friedrich Nietzsche, it's, I think, a great way to spend your summer. And you can find out more about that on philosophyportal.online. So with that being said, Thomas, thank you for joining me. And we'll catch you on the next Nietzsche Dialogue.
To say there's nothing better to do, and I emphasize the nothing.